Back in 1973, William Friedkin released a horror movie that arguably went on to become a blueprint for the horror genre for years to follow. The Exorcist was based on William Peter Blatty's novel of the same name, with Blatty also writing the screenplay for the film. 4 years later, the much-anticipated sequel, Exorcist II: The Heretic, hit the screens and disappointed audiences in ways that are almost indescribable. Sure, we had Regan in the follow-up movie, but very little of it made sense to many viewers and critics. Reports around the film's legacy often mentioned that audiences laughed, jeered, and reacted badly to it, and even William Friedkin later called it a horrible picture. Then, after more than a decade, The Exorcist III happened. It didn't bring Regan back as a character, yet it managed to restore the seriousness, dread, and spiritual unease that fans associated with Friedkin's original. In fact, it's now considered by many viewers to be one of the best films in the franchise. And in my opinion, it should have been accepted as the true sequel to the 1973 movie much earlier. So how did William Peter Blatty manage to capture the magic that we thought was lost forever? Let's find out. Why Exorcist II failed so badly. Exorcist II: The Heretic was directed by John Boorman and released in 1977. It became infamous for its poor critical reception and hostile audience reaction. Let me start by telling you why Exorcist II became such a colossal failure. The biggest issue was that neither William Friedkin nor William Peter Blatty shaped the sequel in the way that they had shaped the first movie. Blatty wrote the original novel and screenplay, and Friedkin directed the 1973 classic. Without them guiding the story, the sequel had to use familiar characters while moving in a completely different direction. The film wasn't based on a Blatty novel, and instead created its own continuation. It brought back familiar faces, including Linda Blair as Regan, Max von Sydow as Father Merrin, and Kitty Wynn as Sharon Spencer. But the result was a strange, confused sequel that felt disconnected from the terrifying simplicity of the original. The production itself was also complicated. Writing the script, casting, and shaping the final film were not easy processes, and the movie developed a reputation as one of horror's most notorious misfires. British critic Mark Kermode later called Exorcist II one of the worst films ever made, and that kind of reaction tells you how badly the sequel damaged the franchise's reputation. 13 years later, William Peter Blatty, who initially had no strong interest in making another Exorcist sequel, came up with a story called Legion, but he chose wisely. No Regan. No attempt to continue the bizarre plot of the second movie. Blatty shifted his focus to Lieutenant William F. Kinderman, who was actually a major character in his original novel, but had a smaller role in Friedkin's film adaptation. In 1983, Blatty published the novel Legion, and when it found an audience, he began thinking of turning it into a screenplay. Interestingly, Warner Brothers was still eager to continue the franchise despite the disaster of The Heretic. Blatty later recalled that everyone wanted Exorcist III and that Friedkin loved the story idea even before the script was completed. At one point, Friedkin was attached to direct the project, but the reunion didn't last long. Creative differences between Friedkin and Blatty eventually caused Friedkin to leave, and Blatty shaped the story himself. Honestly, I'm kinda glad that happened because what we got was an unusually fresh horror story. It wasn't built around Regan's possession. It wasn't trying to recreate the original exorcism scene beat for beat. Instead, it became a psychological mystery about evil, faith, murder, grief, and the spiritual aftermath of Father Karras's sacrifice. Sure, it wasn't a box office monster, but it was so much better than John Boorman's unintentional horror comedy. So what made Blatty change his mind? Firstly, he openly disliked Exorcist II. He joked about how bad it was, and even suggested at one point that Warner Brothers should pull it from theaters and let him remix it into something else, almost like a parody-style rescue mission. Blatty then decided that the franchise deserved better. Rather than letting The Heretic be the final word on The Exorcist, he began developing a new story that could restore some of the credibility the series had lost. Legion becomes Exorcist III. Blatty originally wanted the film to be closer to Legion, but Morgan Creek insisted on connecting it more directly to the Exorcist brand and demanded changes, including an exorcism climax. Blatty had no interest in making the film about spinning heads or someone levitating from a bed again, so he came up with a psychological mystery that still connected to the original Exorcist through similar themes of evil, guilt, faith, and spiritual torment. However, he didn't originally want to sell it simply as Exorcist III. He wanted the title to remain Legion, just like the novel. Because after The Heretic, he didn't want the project to feel like a cheap attempt to exploit the IP. But of course, it is Hollywood, and how can Hollywood ever miss out on using an established brand? The studio insisted on using the Exorcist III title to make the connection obvious and increase commercial appeal. Blatty was overruled, but making the movie was an ordeal in itself. Studios were interested in bringing Legion to the screen, sure, but there was one major problem. Many did not want Blatty in the director's chair because he had only directed one film before this, The Ninth Configuration. He was being turned down left and right when he reached out to publicist Steve Jaffe, who had worked around both the Exorcist novel and the 1973 movie's publicity. Jaffe helped package the project in a way that made it more attractive, and he eventually worked as an associate producer on The Exorcist III. Interestingly, both Morgan Creek and Carolco showed interest in backing the film, but Blatty went ahead with Morgan Creek. Carolco reportedly had interest in a more conventional sequel direction involving an adult Regan McNeil, which Blatty didn't want to pursue. John Carpenter, who was also connected to discussions around adapting Legion at one point, later said that Blatty was resistant because he wanted to direct it and stay close to his novel. Jaffe later summed it up beautifully. He said that the blessing of Exorcist II: The Heretic was that it was so bad, it made Blatty decide to turn Legion into The Exorcist III and direct it himself. According to Jaffe, Blatty wanted to put his heart and soul into it to erase the memory of the second film. However, Blatty did have to make a lot of compromises to make The Exorcist III happen, especially with the ending. He later explained that the original story he sold Morgan Creek and the one he shot ended with Kinderman shooting patient X. There was no exorcism, but the studio wanted an exorcism sequence, and Blatty eventually decided it was better for him to do it himself than allow someone else to reshape the ending completely. Finally, when the movie hit screens, it received a mixed but much stronger response than Exorcist II. Over time, its reputation grew. Rotten Tomatoes' critical consensus now describes it as a talky, literary sequel with some scary moments that rival anything from the original. What was Exorcist III actually about? The Exorcist III follows Lieutenant Kinderman as he investigates Georgetown murders with the hallmarks of the Gemini Killer, a serial murderer who was executed years earlier. Blatty had already made it clear that we would not be getting a rerun of the original film. In a 1990 interview, he said audiences would get a strong link to the first film and some fireworks. He also clarified that although there would be an exorcism in the finished film, it was not what the movie was building toward for most of its runtime. And when we sit down to watch the movie, we can feel that difference immediately. This is a grounded horror thriller, not an over-the-top possession movie. The story is set roughly 15 years after the first Exorcist film and revolves around Lieutenant Kinderman, now played by George C. Scott. Kinderman and his friend Father Dyer try to cheer each other up on the anniversary of the death of someone dear to both of them, Father Damien Karras. However, their quiet moment of remembrance is disturbed when a series of gruesome murders begins in Georgetown. The religious angle enters immediately because a priest is killed inside a confession booth and a church is desecrated. The investigation takes a surprising turn when fingerprints recovered from the crime scenes don't match one another, suggesting that different people may be committing the murders. This is when Kinderman starts sensing that something's off. The murders resemble the MO of the Gemini Killer, a serial killer who was executed the same night Father Karras died. Things become even more suspicious and emotionally painful for Kinderman when Father Dyer is found murdered in a hospital. Oh God, the way Father Dyer dies, the killer leaves containers filled with his blood, and the scene is one of the most grotesque details in the film. Following the trail of clues, Kinderman finds a patient in the psychiatric ward known as Patient X. This man was found wandering the streets 15 years ago with no memory of who he was. The moment Kinderman steps into that isolated room, he is shocked to see that patient X looks exactly like Father Karras. And somehow, this man knows all about the murders, both past and present, in far too much detail. Soon, Kinderman becomes convinced that the Gemini killer is somehow still active despite being dead for years. For most of its runtime, The Exorcist III feels like a slow-burn thriller, but Blatty brilliantly uses ambient horror and sound to evoke a constant sense of uneasiness. The shots of sculptures, Jesus figures, hospital corridors, and dimly lit rooms are incredible. Man, I was blown away. And I absolutely understand why Mike Flanagan calls Exorcist III a great movie and has discussed watching it while preparing his own take on the franchise. Because honestly, there are so many reasons The Exorcist III works. The way Blatty brings Father Dyer and Kinderman forward, two supporting characters connected to the first story, and focuses on their friendship is genuinely touching. I mean, Kinderman literally gives Dyer a penguin plushie. So on one hand, we have this emotional warmth to the story, and on the other, an atmosphere of pure spiritual sickness. Even Kinderman's family scenes have this strange unease, as if something horrible is happening right next door. Humor, warmth, love, grief, and horror are all placed together, and Blatty somehow pulls it off. The man uses horror like seasoning in this film, and it actually works. Top that off with the intense conversations between Kinderman and Patient X, and The Exorcist III gives us some of the best jump scares and dialogue scenes in horror sequel history. The problems with the theatrical cut. Morgan Creek demanded major changes after principal photography, including a new exorcism climax and the addition of Father Mourning. Brad Dourif and Jason Miller both became part of the theatrical version's complicated Patient X presentation. But there are downsides too. For starters, some of the extended confrontation scenes between Kinderman and Patient X, who keeps shifting between the personas of the Gemini killer and Father Karras, can become confusing to follow, especially in the theatrical version. The character shifts between the appearances of Jason Miller and Brad Dourif, which creates a striking effect, but can also make it difficult to determine exactly what Kinderman is seeing from one scene to the next. When both Kinderman and Father Dyer were recast, that was still easy to accept, but this constant shifting becomes distracting for some viewers. The other issue with the theatrical cut is the ending, as I mentioned before. The studio forced Blatty to shoot a new finale with a full-scale exorcism months after principal photography had ended. That led to the addition of Father Mourning, whose arrival at Patient X's cell feels somewhat underexplained. Nicole Williamson was brought in as Father Mourning specifically for the new climax. And you know what? No matter how satisfying The Exorcist III is compared to the second movie, and even though the climax is well executed, it still feels noticeably different from the earlier tone of the film. But Blatty is the last person I would blame, because the later Legion version restored much of his original concept, even though it had to be reconstructed from lower quality source materials because some of the original footage was lost. The director's cut adds more context for the supernatural aspects used in the narrative, and it makes the story feel closer to Blatty's intended psychological mystery. In this version, Kinderman investigates deeper into what happened after Father Karras' death. There's more explanation for what became of Karras' body and how the Gemini killer entered the story. What actually happened to Father Karras? In The Exorcist III, the Gemini killer explains that the Master, generally understood as Pazuzu, placed the spirit of James Veneman into Karras' body as revenge for Karras defeating the demon during Regan's exorcism. So what exactly happened to Father Karras? Well, it's worse than what we expected. Patient X eventually explains that a powerful demonic entity known as the Master wanted revenge on Father Karras for defeating Pazuzu years earlier. Rather than simply destroying Karras outright, the demon came up with something much more brutal. It allowed the recently executed Gemini killer, James Veneman, to enter Karras' broken body after Karras fell from Regan's window. But there was a problem. Karras' body had been so badly damaged by the fall that it could barely function. When he was first discovered wandering the streets, he was in a catatonic condition. Over the next 15 years, the Gemini killer slowly rebuilt control and recovered enough to begin killing again. Man, I genuinely feel bad for Father Karras, and I guess we all do. That poor man could never truly find peace. Even after death, His soul remained trapped inside his own body and was forced to helplessly witness the Gemini killer and the demonic force using him for murder. Now, coming to the ending, we know that the theatrical cut has a dramatic exorcism at the end, where Father Morning confronts the evil inside Patient X. But in Blatty's original concept, the ending was much more subtle. There was a brief moment when Father Karras overcame the influence of the Gemini killer, and Kinderman realized there was no miracle coming, so he made the painful decision to end Karras' suffering himself. Sure, it might have been a quieter and bleaker ending, but trust me, it would have remained true to Blatty's vision. Even without a large-scale demon-ousted ritual, it would still have been one of the best movies in the franchise. For that matter, even if it had simply been titled Legion, I think Blatty would have still driven the point home. Outro. Alright guys, that's it for today. The movie didn't hash out Regan's possession again and had no direct connection to Regan as a character. Yet, The Exorcist III is one of the best horror films I've watched, and I guess I can explain just about why. To make a slow-burn horror movie work in the 90s took guts and genius. William Peter Blatty showed signs of both and deserves to go down in history for giving us one of the most fascinating horror sequels ever made. Do let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.